Los Angeles International Airport buzzed with life as people hurried through the terminal, dragging suitcases, checking flight schedules, and making last-minute calls. Amidst the chaos, one man stood quietly in the first-class line, exuding a sense of calm that contrasted sharply with the luxury and urgency surrounding him. That man was Keanu Reeves. Dressed in a simple plaid shirt, worn-out jeans, and scuffed boots, Keanu carried nothing but a well-traveled backpack slung over one shoulder. There was nothing about his appearance that screamed wealth or celebrity. No designer labels, no flashy jewelry, just an air of quiet self-assurance. If anything, he looked more like a backpacker than a Hollywood star. But that was exactly the kind of person he was, someone who moved through the world with an effortless humility, never demanding attention, never needing validation. People in the first-class line barely noticed him, their minds preoccupied with their own journeys. Yet, for those who did glance his way, there was something undeniably intriguing about him. Unlike the other passengers, who anxiously checked their phones or glanced around impatiently, Keanu stood still, his expression unreadable, as if he were simply soaking in the moment. His presence in the line felt almost out of place, not because he didn't belong there, but because he didn't carry the typical entitlement that so often accompanied first-class travelers. And in a world obsessed with status and appearances, his quiet demeanor made him stand out even more. What happened next would leave everyone on that plane speechless. Just a few steps behind Keanu Reeves in the first-class line stood Jonathan Smith. If Keanu was the embodiment of effortless humility, Jonathan was the opposite, loud without making a sound, demanding attention without saying a word. He was the kind of man who carried his status like a trophy, expecting the world to acknowledge it. Dressed in an impeccably tailored navy suit, polished leather shoes that gleamed under the airport's artificial lighting, and a cologne so strong it left an invisible trail behind him, Jonathan Smith was the textbook definition of a man who believed in the power of appearances. Jonathan wasn't the type to blend into the crowd, he didn't just move, he strutted. Every step he took had purpose, a calculated precision that announced to everyone around him, "I belong here." His sharp, assessing gaze darted around the terminal, sizing up the people around him. When his eyes landed on Keanu, a flicker of disbelief crossed his face, quickly replaced by an amused smirk. "First class, huh?" he muttered under his breath, just loud enough for Keanu to hear. His voice carried a mix of sarcasm and surprise, as if the very idea of a man dressed so simply standing in the same line as him was some kind of joke. Keanu turned his head slightly, his face calm, unreadable. "Yeah," he responded, his tone neutral. "The world is full of surprises." That answer didn't sit well with Jonathan. He expected discomfort, embarrassment, maybe even an excuse. Instead, Keanu's unshaken demeanor annoyed him. He had spent years perfecting the art of exuding power, his wealth, his connections, the way he carried himself, it all worked to put people in their place. But this man, dressed like he had just stepped out of a roadside diner, didn't seem fazed in the slightest. Jonathan chuckled, shaking his head. "Nothing personal," he continued, his tone casual but his intent sharp. "It's just rare to see someone so casual in first class." His smile was polite, but his words dripped with condescension. Keanu didn't react. He simply turned his gaze forward, as if the conversation didn't matter. Jonathan, however, wasn't finished. He had made up his mind about the man standing in front of him, and he was determined to prove a point. What he didn't know was that this flight would teach him a lesson he would never forget. As Jonathan Smith settled into his plush first-class seat, he let out a quiet chuckle of disbelief. Of all the people in the world, of all the possible seat assignments, fate had placed Keanu Reeves right next to him. He shook his head, suppressing a smirk as he adjusted his cufflinks. There was no way this guy actually belonged here. Maybe he had won a sweepstakes. Maybe someone gifted him the ticket. Either way, Jonathan felt confident in his assumption, Keanu was out of place. The flight attendants moved through the cabin, offering pre-flight drinks. Jonathan, with his usual air of confidence, requested a glass of champagne, flashing the kind of smile that was meant to impress. When Keanu's turn came, he simply asked for water. Jonathan let out a short laugh. Water? Really? Man, you're flying first class. Live a little. Keanu took the bottle from the flight attendant, offering a small, polite smile. I'm good with this. Sometimes, simplicity is enough. Jonathan raised an eyebrow. Simplicity? That was a word people used when they couldn't afford anything better. He leaned back in his seat, studying Keanu for a moment before deciding to dig a little deeper. So, what do you do? He asked, his voice carrying the casual indifference of someone who believed they already knew the answer. Keanu adjusted the straps of his backpack under the seat in front of him before responding. I work in film. Jonathan's smirk returned. Oh, I see. Commercials. Indie stuff. He nodded as if he understood. It's interesting how people try to find their place, you know. But sometimes, certain spaces just aren't meant for everyone. For the first time, Keanu turned to look at him directly. His expression remained unreadable, his demeanor calm. I think we all have our place, he said simply, and sometimes, it's exactly where we are. Jonathan chuckled, shaking his head. That's nice. Kind of philosophical, even. But real life doesn't work that way. The world's competitive. If you don't show what you have, people will ignore you. Keanu didn't react immediately. Instead, he took a small sip of water, letting the words settle. Around them, other passengers were beginning to take notice of the exchange. A few subtle glances, an occasional turned head, people were listening. Maybe, Keanu said finally, his voice steady. Or maybe true success doesn't need to be shouted about. It speaks for itself. Jonathan's smirk faltered slightly. Something about that response unsettled him. He had built his life on proving himself, his wealth, his status, the things he owned. But this man, sitting right beside him, didn't seem to feel the need to prove anything. The tension between them lingered in the air, unspoken yet palpable. Jonathan didn't know it yet, but this conversation was only beginning. And by the end of this flight, everything he thought he understood about success, status, and self-worth would be turned upside down. As the plane leveled out at cruising altitude, the atmosphere in first class remained polished and quiet, except for the subtle tension simmering between Keanu Reeves and Jonathan Smith. Their conversation had drawn the ears of more than a few nearby passengers. Some exchanged quick glances, others subtly leaned in as if they were casually listening, but the air in the cabin had undeniably shifted. Jonathan, still convinced that he had the upper hand, took another slow sip of his champagne, savoring the way the crisp bubbles danced on his tongue. He was used to being admired, envied even, for his success and sharp wit. Yet, something about Keanu's unshakable calmness gnawed at him. He wanted a reaction. Look, Jonathan said, adjusting his seatbelt slightly. I'm not trying to be a jerk, I just think it's interesting. People who talk about simplicity and humility, they're usually the ones who never had the opportunity for more. When you've worked for it, when you've actually earned success, you start to appreciate the finer things in life. You don't just settle for the bare minimum. Keanu listened, nodding slightly, as if carefully weighing his words before responding. The hum of the airplane engines filled the brief silence between them. Then, he spoke, his voice steady, unbothered. Maybe the best things in life aren't about what you have, but about what you give. Jonathan let out a short, amused laugh. Yeah. That sounds nice. But in the real world, money talks. People listen to success. You wouldn't be sitting here if you weren't someone, right? Keanu glanced out the window, as if considering something far beyond the reach of their conversation. Then, he turned back to Jonathan. I think the way you treat people says more about you than any seat you're sitting in. It was subtle, but the shift in the cabin was becoming noticeable. A woman seated a few rows ahead, dressed in a sharp business suit, glanced over her shoulder. An older gentleman across the aisle, who had been flipping through a newspaper, lowered it slightly to listen. Even the flight attendants, busy serving drinks, seemed to slow their pace near their row, stealing quick glances at the exchange unfolding. Jonathan, however, was still convinced he was steering the conversation. He leaned back, his confidence unshaken. "That's a nice philosophy, but it's not how the world works. You think people respect humility? No. They respect power. They respect people who command a room. Look around, this whole cabin is filled with people who got here because they pushed harder, fought harder, and took what they deserved. It's not about kindness, it's about knowing your worth." Keanu studied him for a moment before replying. His voice was quiet, yet it cut through the space between them like a knife. "Knowing your worth has nothing to do with proving it to others." Jonathan's jaw tightened slightly. The words hit something deeper, something he wasn't prepared to confront. He glanced around, suddenly aware that more people were paying attention than before. Some were nodding slightly, as if silently agreeing with Keanu's perspective. Others were simply watching, their expressions unreadable. A flight attendant approached their row with a polite smile, subtly diffusing the growing tension. "Would you care for another drink, sir?" she asked Jonathan. He hesitated for half a second before clearing his throat. "Yeah, another champagne." She turned to Keanu. "And for you, mister?" "Just water, thank you," Keanu replied with a small nod. Jonathan let out another chuckle, though it sounded less self-assured than before. "Still keeping it simple, huh?" Keanu smiled. "Always." Jonathan wanted to push back, wanted to have the last word, but for the first time in a long time, he found himself at a loss. The confidence that had once felt so unshakable now wavered under the weight of something he couldn't quite explain. What he failed to realize was that this wasn't just an argument anymore. This was something else, something deeper. And while he had spent years believing he could win any conversation with sheer bravado, this time, he wasn't so sure. The plane continued its journey, but the real turbulence was happening right there in seat 2A. As the hours passed and the plane soared above the clouds, Jonathan Smith sat in his first-class seat, but for the first time, he wasn't entirely comfortable. Something about the way Keanu Reeves carried himself, calm, unbothered, self-assured in a way that required no performance, was beginning to unsettle him. The conversation between them had started as a casual jab, a bit of playful superiority, but now it had taken on a different weight. And the worst part? The other passengers had noticed, too. Jonathan had spent his life believing that success was something you had to prove. Show your wealth. Show your power. Show people why you belonged. That was how you commanded respect. But Keanu? He sat there, relaxed, composed, as if none of it mattered. As if respect was something you earned through presence alone, not through displays of status. Then, just as Jonathan was about to open his mouth to reclaim control of the conversation, the flight attendant returned. She carried herself with a practiced professionalism, but there was a distinct note of warmth in her voice as she spoke. "Mr. Reeves," she said with a smile, "the captain asked me to inform you that your connection in Tokyo has been confirmed. He also sends his best regards." The words landed like a thunderclap. Jonathan blinked. His mind processed the name she had just spoken, but for a moment, he thought he must have misheard. Reeves? His stomach tightened. His pulse picked up. He turned, slowly, his eyes locking onto the man sitting next to him, the man he had been subtly ridiculing for the entire flight. No. No way. Jonathan's mouth went dry. He stared at Keanu as if seeing him for the first time. The simple plaid shirt. The worn-out jeans. The backpack slung beneath his seat. None of it had screamed wealth or power, and yet, Jonathan suddenly felt like the biggest fool on the plane. You're Keanu Reeves. His voice came out quieter than he intended, almost hesitant. Keanu, who had just nodded politely to the flight attendant, turned to him with a small, knowing smile. "Is something wrong, Jonathan?" he asked, his voice as calm as ever. Jonathan opened his mouth, then closed it again. He scrambled to recover, to backpedal, to fix the situation before it slipped further out of his grasp. I had no idea," he stammered, his usual smooth confidence crumbling. "I mean, you didn't say who you were." Keanu shrugged. "I didn't think it was necessary." The response hit Jonathan harder than anything else. It was such a simple statement, yet it carried so much weight. Because he, Jonathan, had spent the entire flight trying to prove his worth, while Keanu, a man infinitely more successful than him, had never once felt the need to. The realization made his face burn. I didn't mean to offend you," Jonathan blurted out, the words tumbling over themselves. "I just didn't know who I was talking to." Keanu took a breath and let it out slowly before answering. "But that's the thing, Jonathan." He leaned in slightly, his voice still soft, still steady. "It shouldn't matter." Jonathan felt as if the entire cabin had turned to look at him. He wasn't sure if they actually had, but suddenly, he was acutely aware of every other passenger within earshot. "You see," Keanu continued, "how you treat people shouldn't change based on who they are, or who you think they are." His eyes held Jonathan's in a way that made it impossible to look away. "Respect isn't about status. It's about character." Jonathan swallowed hard. The words cut through him with a clarity he wasn't prepared for. He had built his entire life around the idea that people needed to know who he was in order to respect him. But Keanu had just undone all of that in a single moment. There was nothing left to say. Nothing he could argue. Nothing he could take back. For the rest of the flight, Jonathan sat in silence. His champagne glass, once a symbol of his status, sat untouched on the tray in front of him. He replayed every word he had said, every smug remark, every assumption he had made. And all of it, every bit of it, now felt hollow. The plane continued its journey across the sky, but for Jonathan, something far more significant had shifted. For the first time in a long time, Jonathan Smith had nothing to say. As the plane glided smoothly through the sky, he sat motionless in his seat, staring blankly at his hands. The reality of the situation pressed down on him like an invisible weight, one that had nothing to do with altitude and everything to do with his own arrogance. He had spent the entire flight subtly mocking Keanu Reeves, measuring him by the shallow metrics he had always believed mattered: appearance, status, wealth. He had assumed that the man sitting next to him was beneath him. And now, the truth sat before him, undeniable and unshakable. Keanu Reeves didn't just belong in first class. He could have bought the entire cabin. And yet, he had never once acted like it. Jonathan exhaled sharply, shaking his head at himself. How many times had he done this before? Judged someone too quickly, assumed their worth based on the surface? He had always prided himself on being someone who understood the way the world worked, that respect was earned through power, through dominance, through making sure everyone knew you belonged. But Keanu had just shattered that illusion without even trying. The silence between them stretched on, heavier now. Jonathan could feel the occasional glance from other passengers, the weight of unspoken judgment. People had noticed his behavior. They had heard his words. And now, he felt exposed in a way he never had before. He cleared his throat, forcing himself to say something, anything, to break the tension. I think I owe you an apology." His voice was quieter than usual, missing its usual confidence. He turned to Keanu, but the man wasn't looking at him. He was gazing out the window, completely at peace, as if their conversation had never unsettled him in the first place. Finally, Keanu turned, his expression unreadable but patient. "For what?" he asked, his tone making it clear he wanted Jonathan to actually think about his answer. Jonathan hesitated, licking his lips. I mean, I was arrogant. I judged you before I even knew anything about you. He exhaled, running a hand through his hair. But not just because you're you. I mean, obviously, I wouldn't have said half that stuff if I had known. But that's the point, isn't it? Keanu didn't nod or affirm him. He just let the words hang in the air, waiting for Jonathan to come to the conclusion on his own. Jonathan sighed. I shouldn't have treated you differently just because I thought you were someone else. Keanu finally gave a small nod. That's the thing about respect, he said. It's easy to give when you think someone deserves it. The real test is whether you can give it when you don't. Jonathan let that sink in. He had always thought of himself as a successful man, someone who had earned his place in the world through ambition and drive. But sitting next to Keanu Reeves, someone who had built a career and a reputation on kindness, humility, and integrity, he suddenly felt small. Not because Keanu had made him feel that way, but because, for the first time in years, he saw himself clearly. The plane continued its steady journey, the hum of the engines filling the space between them. Jonathan had always thought of first class as a symbol of his success, proof that he had made it. But now, he wasn't sure if he even deserved to be sitting there. He glanced at Keanu, who had returned to his quiet contemplation, sipping his water as if nothing about the flight had been remarkable at all. But for Jonathan, it had been life-changing. For the first time in a long time, he didn't feel the need to prove anything. And maybe, just maybe, that was the first step toward truly understanding success. As the plane neared its destination, the once vibrant arrogance in Jonathan Smith had faded into a quiet introspection. He was no longer concerned with commanding attention, nor did he feel the same smug confidence he had carried onto the flight. Instead, a profound sense of self-awareness crept into his mind, one that made him question the way he had been living his life. For years, Jonathan had measured success in the most tangible of ways: money, power, status. To him, wealth wasn't just about comfort, it was proof that he had one. He had always believed that people respected those who showed their achievements openly, who reminded the world, at every turn, that they belonged at the top. And yet, sitting next to Keanu Reeves, a man who had more success than Jonathan could ever dream of, he realized that none of it truly mattered. Keanu had walked onto that plane in old jeans, a plaid shirt, and a weathered backpack, not once needing to assert himself, not once demanding acknowledgement. He had let Jonathan assume, let him talk, let him measure the world by his narrow definition of worth. And when the truth was revealed, Keanu hadn't gloated, hadn't put him in his place with sharp words or smug satisfaction. Instead, he had simply remained himself, calm, kind, unshaken. And that was what unsettled Jonathan the most. He glanced around the cabin, suddenly aware of how different things felt. The first-class section, which had always been a place where he felt at home, now seemed foreign. The champagne he had once sipped so proudly sat untouched on his tray table. Even the tailored suit that once made him feel powerful now felt constricting, as if it had been armor disguising something fragile underneath. Jonathan stole another glance at Keanu. The actor sat with his hands resting lightly on his lap, his expression serene as he gazed out the window, watching the clouds roll by. He had no idea how much of an impact he had made on Jonathan in such a short amount of time. Or perhaps he did, and simply chose not to acknowledge it. Jonathan took a deep breath. It wasn't often that he apologized, not in a way that truly mattered. But this was different. This wasn't about salvaging his ego or smoothing over an awkward situation. It was about owning up to something real. Clearing his throat, he turned slightly toward Keanu. I need to say something, he admitted. His voice lacked its usual confidence, but for the first time, he didn't mind. I was a jerk. Keanu turned to him, his expression patient but unreadable. He didn't respond right away, giving Jonathan the space to continue. I judged you, Jonathan said, shaking his head at himself. Not just because of how you looked, but because I thought I knew the type of person you were. And I was wrong. Completely wrong. He exhaled. And I don't just mean because you're you, Keanu Reeves. I mean that even if you weren't, even if you were just some random guy in a plaid shirt, I still should have treated you with respect. And I didn't. Keanu studied him for a moment, then gave a small nod. I appreciate that, he said simply. Jonathan wasn't sure what he expected, maybe a speech about forgiveness, maybe a reassurance that it was all water under the bridge. But that wasn't Keanu's style. He didn't make things bigger than they needed to be. He let people come to their own conclusions, in their own time. And that, Jonathan realized, was why people respected him. For years, Jonathan had believed that respect had to be demanded, forced, won like a trophy. But Keanu had shown him something entirely different, that true respect came from the way you carried yourself, from the way you treated people when no one was watching, from the quiet confidence of knowing who you were without needing to prove it. As the plane began its descent, Jonathan felt a strange sense of relief. Not because the flight was ending, but because something inside him had shifted. He didn't know what it meant yet, didn't know how it would change him moving forward, but for the first time in a long time, he was willing to ask himself the hard questions. Maybe success wasn't about being seen. Maybe it was about being worthy of being seen. And maybe, just maybe, the real work wasn't in proving his worth to the world, but in proving it to himself. As the plane taxied toward the terminal, Jonathan Smith remained seated, watching Keanu Reeves with a quiet sense of admiration. The actor had returned to reading his book, completely unbothered by the weight of their earlier conversation. For Keanu, this flight had likely been just another routine journey, nothing extraordinary, nothing worth remembering. But for Jonathan, it had been something else entirely. He had boarded that plane as the same man he had always been, driven, proud, convinced that success was something to be displayed, something that had to be proven to the world. But in the span of just a few hours, everything he thought he understood about success, status, and respect had been quietly dismantled by a man who had never once tried to prove anything at all. Keanu hadn't argued with him. He hadn't boasted or tried to put Jonathan in his place. He had simply been. And somehow, that alone had been enough to shake Jonathan's entire perspective. As the flight attendants moved through the cabin, preparing passengers for disembarkation, Jonathan stole one last glance at Keanu. He wanted to say something meaningful, something that could encapsulate everything he had learned in these short few hours. But what could he say? Instead, he settled for something simple. Something real. "Hey," he said quietly. "Thanks." Keanu looked up, his face calm as ever. "For what?" Jonathan hesitated, then gave a small, almost self-deprecating smile. "For not proving me right." A flicker of amusement crossed Keanu's face, but he simply nodded. "Take care of yourself, Jonathan." And with that, he stood up, slinging his well-worn backpack over his shoulder as he stepped into the aisle. Jonathan remained seated for a few moments longer, watching as Keanu walked toward the exit. As he reached the front of the cabin, a few passengers who had recognized him finally worked up the courage to greet him. He smiled warmly, exchanged a few quiet words, posed for a quick photo, but there was no rush, no arrogance, no trace of the kind of entitlement Jonathan had always associated with people at his level of success. He wasn't performing for the world. He was just being himself. Jonathan let out a slow breath and glanced down at his own hands. For the first time in a long time, he wondered if maybe, just maybe, he had been doing it all wrong. As he finally stood to gather his things, he carried a different kind of weight than when he had first boarded the plane. Not the burden of proving himself, but the realization that he didn't have to. Perhaps, he thought, the real measure of a man isn't in how loudly he announces his worth, but in how quietly he carries it. The story of Jonathan Smith and Keanu Reeves isn't just an entertaining anecdote, it's a powerful reflection of the way we perceive success, respect, and self-worth in the real world. Too often, we judge people by surface-level indicators, their clothes, their possessions, their outward confidence. We assume that wealth and power must be flaunted to be validated. But Keanu's quiet humility proves otherwise. In a world obsessed with status and materialism, this story reminds us that true respect isn't something you demand, it's something you earn through character. Success isn't about proving your worth to others, it's about knowing who you are without needing external validation. The most powerful people aren't necessarily the loudest in the room, they're the ones who move through life with grace, kindness, and an unwavering sense of self. This lesson applies everywhere, whether in business, relationships, or daily interactions. How we treat others, regardless of their status, says more about us than any title or bank account ever could. And ultimately, the real measure of a person isn't found in what they own, but in the way they choose to show up in the world.